£350 million a week for the NHS. That promise and others didn't just fail, they've cost Britain billions. No wonder 62% of Brits now say Brexit has gone badly. So, what went wrong? How did a campaign built on promises of national renewal ended up costing Britain billions? In this video, we expose the 5 biggest false claims that shaped the Brexit vote and the steep price the country is still paying. Let's start with the lie plastered across the side of a red bus. Remember that red Vote Leave bus with the bold claim, "We send the EU £350 million a week, let's fund our NHS instead." Yeah, that headline-grabbing slogan became one of the most infamous symbols of the Brexit campaign, but here's the thing. It wasn't just misleading, it was flat-out wrong. Let's break it down. That £350 million a week figure, it ignored 2 key facts. First, the UK actually got a rebate from the EU, a permanent discount that Margaret Thatcher negotiated back in the 1980s. Second, the EU also spent money in the UK on things like farming subsidies and regional development. When you account for those, the real net payment to the EU wasn't £350 million, it was about £161 million a week, less than half. Independent fact-checkers and even the UK Statistics Authority stepped in during the campaign and said this claim was potentially misleading. But Vote Leave stood by it anyway, even as Remain campaigners were calling it bogus and accusing them of misleading voters. Now, even if the full £350 million a week had somehow been available, would it have been enough to transform the NHS? Not even close. The English NHS alone costs about £3.63 billion a week to run, so £350 million, assuming it was real, would have just been a drop in the ocean. But what happened after the referendum? Did the NHS suddenly get showered with extra cash? Well, the NHS budget did rise by more than £350 million a week between 2015 and 16 and 2019 and 20, but that increase had nothing to do with Brexit savings. There weren't any. That extra funding came from higher taxes, borrowing, and cutting budgets elsewhere. And let's not forget the pressure to fund the NHS has only grown, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Brexit didn't just affect funding, it hit staffing too. Before Brexit, the NHS relied heavily on nurses and doctors from the EU and EFTA countries. But right after the referendum, new arrivals from those regions slowed to almost nothing. On top of that, a new language testing regime made it harder to recruit. So what did the government do? It pivoted hard to recruit from Africa and Asia. By 2021, most newly registered doctors in the UK were trained outside the UK, EU or EFTA. Between the referendum and now, the number of non-EU doctors licensed in the UK jumped from 72,000 to 112,000. Non-EU nurses went from 67,000 to 124,000. That's a big increase. But it came with trade-offs. Recruiting from outside the EU means dealing with strict visa rules like salary thresholds. That's been a disaster for social care, where wages are often too low to meet the requirements. So, where are we now? NHS spending keeps climbing. By 2023 to 24, the health budget hit £226 billion. In the 1949-50 financial year, it was only 3.6% of GDP. Today, it's more than 8%, and it's not slowing down. The OBR says public health spending will likely grow by 3% every year, adjusted for inflation. By 2073, it could hit 14.5% of GDP. That's around £180 billion more than today in real terms. The NHS is facing long-term challenges, an aging population, rising illnesses, and the growing cost of new treatments. But the idea that leaving the EU would solve all this with a magical £350 million a week, that was never real. It was a headline. You might remember hearing that once Britain left the European Union, it would be free to strike powerful, profitable deals with countries all over the world. That narrative sold Brexit as an economic springboard, but here's the reality. Those new deals haven't even come close to replacing what was lost. In 2024, the EU is still the UK's largest trading partner by far. The numbers speak for themselves. 41% of all UK exports still go to the EU. When it comes to imports, it's the same story. Over half of everything Britain buys from abroad, 51% comes from the EU. That's despite all the talk of pivoting to global markets. And trade with EU hasn't just stayed significant, it's also suffered a big hit since Brexit. UK goods exports to the EU in 2024 are still 18% below what they were in 2019. Think about that. 5 years on, and the country still hasn't recovered from the shock. What about all those shiny new trade deals we were promised? Well, they're either minimal or recycled. Take the UK-Japan trade deal, for instance. It sounds like a big win, but in truth it's just a near copy of the deal Japan had already signed with the EU. The UK government's own estimates say it will increase GDP by only 0.1% over 15 years. That's basically a rounding error. Same goes for the much-hyped Australia deal. Again, just a 0.1 GDP boost over 15 years. These deals aren't new engines of growth, they're barely noticeable blips. And even those tiny benefits don't cancel out the damage from losing frictionless trade with the EU. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, Brexit will cause both exports and imports to be about 15% lower in the long term compared to staying in the EU. That's massive. Even the structure of the new trade deals doesn't help much. Most either roll over deals the UK already has as part of the EU, or they're too limited in scope to make much difference. There's been no major shift in global trade patterns that benefits the UK in the way Leave campaigners claimed. The promise was simple. Don't worry about losing access to the EU market, we'll replace it with better deals around the world. But that hasn't happened. The numbers are clear, the impact is visible, and the damage is ongoing. So it appears that those shiny new trade deals weren't quite the game-changer we were told they'd be, but another major selling point of Brexit was taking back control of our borders. The promise? A sharp drop in immigration. What really happened? Let's examine the facts. In the year leading up to June 2023, net migration hit a staggering 906,000. That's not a typo. 906,000 more people arrived in the UK than left. That number has since been revised upwards from the original estimate of 740,000. And the following period wasn't dramatically lower either. Net migration was still at 728,000 by June 2024. Now, most of these arrivals, almost 90%, came from outside the EU. Yes, EU migration dropped sharply after Brexit, as expected, but that drop was more than offset by a surge in non-EU migration. This includes people fleeing the war in Ukraine, international students, skilled workers, and care staff. And let's be clear, this wasn't just a short-term spike. The increase is a part of a wider post-Brexit immigration pattern. So while EU migration fell, the UK opened doors in other areas, whether out of necessity, humanitarian response, or because the labour market demanded it, and what was sold as cutting immigration turned into changing immigration, and the overall numbers shot up. Here's where it gets complicated. Sectors like construction, hospitality, and manufacturing that used to rely on readily available EU workers were suddenly hit hard. Employers started reporting chronic staff shortages, farms struggled to harvest crops, restaurants couldn't find chefs or servers. The construction industry lost skilled labour. These aren't just small hiccups, they're structural gaps in the labour market. The post-Brexit immigration rules didn't solve the problem. They shifted it and, in some cases, made it worse. Some argue that fewer foreign workers push up wages, and yes, in some cases that's true. But in critical areas like healthcare, elderly care, and farming, it just drives up costs, or worse, reduces services and output altogether. So while wages might go up in certain jobs, businesses are left dealing with delays, higher operating costs, or even scaling back. Meanwhile, the costs tied to the immigration system itself have also risen. In 2023-24, government spending on asylum soared to £5.38 billion, up 36% from the year before. That's billions being spent to manage a system that was supposedly going to be more controlled. The Conservative government did try to bring numbers down in 2024. They restricted student visas by banning most international students from bringing dependents. That policy cut study visa applications by 94,000 in a single year. They also blocked care workers from bringing their families and increased the income threshold for sponsoring a foreign spouse. These moves helped reduce numbers slightly, but they came with consequences, especially for sectors that depend on foreign labour to function. So when you hear people say Brexit was about taking back control of immigration, here's the reality. Net migration didn't plummet, it surged. The face of migration changed, but the volume grew larger than ever. The post-Brexit system hasn't delivered the big cut in numbers that was promised. Let's shift gears to another claim, that Brexit would mean frictionless trade and minimal disruptions at the borders. However, billions have been spent, but we're still not there. Let's break that down. Remember the Brexit promise of frictionless borders and minimal costs? That didn't just age badly, it collapsed under the weight of reality. The UK government has already poured at least £4.7 billion into post-Brexit border controls. That's not some projected future spend, that's real money already allocated. And despite all that cash, the system still isn't fully operational. According to the National Audit Office, even after 3 years, full import controls aren't in place. It gets worse. Much of that money was spent on infrastructure, staff and IT systems that never got used. For example, the government spent £62 million building 2 sites near Dover that were never used as border control posts. Another £258 million was blown on 8 temporary border facilities now closed. So what happened? Delays, poor planning and constant changes in direction. Since July 2021, the UK's plan for border checks has been delayed 5 times. The strategy was overhauled in 2022, which meant scaling back the number of checks originally planned. That left the government with hundreds of trained staff who were suddenly redundant. 370 of the 520 border staff hired between 2020 and 2021 weren't needed. Some were reassigned, others not so lucky. And it's not just about wasted money. These delays caused real-world chaos. In April, when checks on plant and animal products from the EU were finally introduced, the government wasn't fully prepared. Then there was the IT meltdown. Just a week before checks kicked in, a technical failure left lorries stranded at border posts for up to 20 hours. That's not exactly the seamless trade we were promised. Now the government says it wants to build the world's most effective border by 2025. Well, that sounds great, but according to the NAO, there's still no clear timetable, no integrated delivery plan, and no agreement on how compliance and enforcement should even work. In short, they're still winging it. And businesses? They've been left in the dark or scrambling to adapt. A lot of them built operations around the idea that trade with the EU would stay smooth. Instead, they faced uncertainty, delays, and extra costs, exactly what Brexit was supposed to eliminate. So here's the takeaway. There's been nothing frictionless or minimal about Brexit's borders. It's been expensive, chaotic, and still incomplete. And the bill keeps growing. Another potential silver lining was expected to be economic growth. We recall the bold claims about a post-Brexit business boom and an increase in investment. Let's see how that played out. Remember all those bold promises about a post-Brexit investment boom, that leaving the EU would somehow unlock a wave of economic growth and business confidence? Well, that was lie number 5, and it didn't take long for reality to expose just how empty that claim really was. Instead of a boom, UK business investment pretty much froze. Imagine this. You're a company trying to plan for the future, but no one can tell you what Brexit actually means, what trade will look like, or how the rules are going to change. So what do? You wait. And that's exactly what happened across the board. Investment plans were shelved, major spending paused, and companies sat on their hands while politicians argued over red flags, backstops, and deal versus no deal. There was no master plan, just political chaos. No roadmap for the future, just years of uncertainty. Businesses naturally hate uncertainty, and the lack of clarity was toxic. The result? Investment flatlined. Not just paused temporarily, but long-term stagnation. This wasn't helped by years of austerity either, which had already drained public investment and infrastructure spending. So while we were told to brace for liftoff, the economy was already grounded. The numbers back this up. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research, NIESR, estimates business investment in 2023 was about 30% lower than it would have been if the UK had stayed in the EU. And while they think businesses might adjust by 2035, the gap will still be around 8%. That translates to a GDP loss of 5 to 6%, or about £2,300 per person. That's not a dip, that's a dent. A long-term hit to the economy. And it gets worse. Labour productivity, already a long-standing issue for the UK, took another blow. NIESR reports a drop of 2 to 2.5% in productivity by 2023 due to Brexit, with projections showing it could shrink by 5 to 6% by 2035. That means businesses are producing less with the same resources. Again, the opposite of what we were promised. Even the IMF and the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility agree. They both forecast UK GDP will remain about 4% smaller than it would have been without Brexit. So no, Brexit didn't unlock a flood of foreign capital or spark a golden age of British business. Instead, it delivered caution, stagnation, and lower productivity. The business boom was never real, just another illusion sold to the public.